In the year 476, a Roman general named Odoacer removed a teenage boy from a throne in Ravenna. The boy's name was Romulus Augustulus, and historians would later mark this moment as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It sounds dramatic, final, like someone flipped a switch and an entire civilization went dark. But here's the question that should keep you wondering as you drift off tonight. What happened to everyone else? Not the emperors, not the generals, not the people whose names get written into history books. What happened to the millions of ordinary people who had spent their entire lives as Romans? The farmers in Gaul, the merchants in Hispania, the bakers in North Africa, the families living in Britain who had never known anything but Roman rule. Did they simply vanish along with the empire? That's the image a lot of us grew up with. One day you're living in the greatest civilization the world has ever seen. Aqueducts bringing water to your city, roads connecting you to distant provinces, laws protecting your property, soldiers keeping the peace. The next day it's gone. Dark ages, chaos, silence. Like someone pulled a curtain across an entire continent and everyone behind it just disappeared. Except that's not what happened. Not even close. See, empires don't work like that. They don't vanish overnight, and neither do the people living inside them. When we say Rome fell in 476, what we're really talking about is a political event. The removal of one particular office, the Western Emperor. But underneath that political headline was something far more complicated and far more human. Millions of people who woke up the next morning, and the morning after that, still farming the same land, still speaking the same language, still burying their dead in the same cemeteries their grandparents used. The empire's government changed hands. The people didn't disappear. They adapted, they endured, and in many cases they simply kept living their lives while historians centuries later argued about exactly when Rome ended. So where did they go? What happened to the vast population that had once called itself Roman? This is one of the quietest mysteries in history, precisely because it's not really about disappearance at all. It's about transformation, and transformation leaves evidence if you know where to look. Archaeologists have spent decades digging through the ruins of villas and cities, tracing pottery styles across centuries, examining what people ate, what they wore, how they buried their loved ones. Historians have pored over law codes written by the new kings who took power after Rome, letters exchanged between bishops and officials, tax records, coins that stopped being minted, and coins that kept circulating anyway. Every piece of that evidence tells a small part of a much larger story about how a civilization of millions transformed itself into something new without simply vanishing into thin air. Before we follow that story deeper, tell me something. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? I always find it fascinating that someone might be listening to this in Melbourne at sunrise, while someone else drifts off in Toronto at midnight. All of us connected across time zones by the same quiet curiosity about the past. Drop it in the comments if you feel like sharing, and if these histories help you unwind or fall asleep. The easiest way to support what I do here is to follow the show on Spotify. Just search for it there, hit follow, and if you're enjoying the journey, leave a 5-star review. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and the link is right there in the description if you want to make it easy on yourself. Now, let's go back to that year, 476, and the moment everyone assumes was the end, because before we can understand what happened to the people, we need to understand what actually fell, and just as importantly, what didn't. Let's start with the boy himself, because his story tells you almost everything you need to know about how quiet this so-called collapse actually was. Romulus Augustulus wasn't a tyrant. He wasn't even really a ruler in any meaningful sense. He was a teenager, probably no older than 16, placed on the throne by his own father, a general trying to control events he could barely manage. His name is almost poetic if you think about it. Romulus, like the legendary founder of Rome. Augustulus, a diminutive nickname meaning Little Augustus. Historians didn't choose that irony, history handed it to them. When Odoacer deposed him, there was no battle for the ages, no burning city, no desperate last stand. Odoacer simply sent the boy into retirement, reportedly with a pension, and took control of Italy himself. That's it. That's the event that generations of textbooks would later call the fall of the Western Roman Empire. A quiet administrative removal, not a dramatic collapse. Historians centuries later needed a clean date, a single moment to mark the end of something so vast and complicated. 476 became that date, useful for textbooks, useful for timelines, but not necessarily how anyone living through it would have understood their own world. Because here's the detail that so often gets lost. Rome didn't disappear in 476. Only half of it lost its emperor. The eastern half of the empire, centred on Constantinople, continued on, unbroken, for almost another 1,000 years. Its emperors still called themselves Roman. Its laws were still Roman law. Its armies still marched under Roman standards. If you had told a merchant in Constantinople that Rome had fallen, they would have looked at you with genuine confusion, because from where they stood, Rome was still very much alive. The Western throne, though, had been weakening for decades before Odoacer ever entered the picture. Emperors came and went with startling speed in the 5th century, some ruling for only months, many controlled by generals who held the actual power behind them. Rome the city wasn't even the political capital anymore. The court had moved to Ravenna, easier to defend, further from the chaos spreading across the provinces. By the time Romulus Augustulus took the throne, the position of Western Emperor had already become largely symbolic, a title without much force behind it. So when Odoacer took control, in many ways he wasn't destroying a system so much as simplifying one that had already been hollowed out. He didn't call himself emperor. He ruled Italy as a king, technically still recognizing the Eastern Emperor as a nominal overlord. Roman administrators kept their positions, Roman senators kept meeting. Roman laws kept being enforced. One office had ended. The people, the institutions, the daily rhythms of Roman life, those continued quietly on, waiting to see what would come next. But to understand why that one office could disappear so quietly, we need to go back before 476. Much further back. Because the Western Empire had not been standing still, waiting peacefully for Odoacer to knock it over. For more than a century, people had been moving across its borders, armies had been changing sides, emperors had been fighting one another, and whole provinces had learned to live with a level of uncertainty that earlier Romans would have found almost unimaginable. The end did not arrive like a door slamming shut. It arrived more like a long road becoming rougher, year after year, until eventually people realized they were no longer travelling through the same country. The Roman Empire had always had borders, of course. Rivers, deserts, walls, forts, watchtowers. The Rhine and Danube formed great lines across Europe, guarded by soldiers and dotted with military settlements. But these were never airtight barriers. People crossed them constantly. Merchants, diplomats, prisoners, labourers, refugees, mercenaries, smugglers and families looking for land, all moved between Roman territory and the worlds beyond it. And beyond those frontiers lived many different peoples. Goths, Franks, Alemanni, Burgundians, Vandals, Suebi. Not nations in the modern sense, with fixed borders, flags and centralised governments. They were looser communities, often made up of smaller groups with different origins, held together by military leaders, shared traditions, and the practical need for protection. Even the names could shift. A group called Gothic in one source might include people whose grandparents had been born somewhere entirely different. A Vandal army might contain former Roman soldiers, captured labourers, allied families, and people who had joined simply because the army offered food, safety, and a future. The labels were real, but they were not always as neat as they sound in a textbook. This matters because we often use the word invasion, and invasion can be accurate. Armies did cross borders, cities were attacked, land was seized. People were killed, displaced, or forced to pay new masters. There was real violence, and it would be wrong to soften it into something harmless. But migration can also be accurate. Many of the people moving into Roman territory were not arriving as a single army bent on destroying Rome. They were seeking farmland, security, political advantage, or refuge from pressures farther east. Sometimes they came with Roman permission. Sometimes they came because Roman officials had lost the ability to stop them. Sometimes they entered as allies, then became enemies, then allies again. The line between outsider and insider could become surprisingly thin. Take the Goths in the late 4th century. Large Gothic populations lived north of the Danube. Then, around the 370s, the Huns began appearing from the eastern steppes. Their arrival disrupted communities across a huge area. Some groups fled, some submitted, some moved westward, looking toward the Roman frontier as a place of relative safety. In 376, the Roman government allowed many Goths to cross the Danube into imperial territory. This was not necessarily a foolish decision. Rome had a long history of accepting outsiders, settling them on land, recruiting their men into the army, and turning potential enemies into taxpayers and soldiers. At least, that was the plan. But the officials responsible for feeding and settling the newcomers seem to have handled the situation badly. Ancient sources describe hunger, exploitation, and desperation. Gothic families were reportedly forced to surrender valuables, perhaps even children, in exchange for food. Whether every detail in those accounts is exact is difficult to know. Ancient historians liked moral lessons and dramatic stories. But there is little doubt that the settlement failed badly enough to produce rebellion. 2 years later, in 378, the Eastern Emperor Valens marched against the Goths near Adrianople, in what is now European Turkey. The battle was a disaster for Rome. Valens was killed. Much of his army was destroyed. For later writers, Adrianople became one of those ominous moments, a warning bell ringing across the empire. But even then, Rome did not fall. The empire recovered, as it had recovered from disasters before. A new emperor, Theodosius, eventually made agreements with Gothic leaders. Some Goths were settled within imperial territory under treaty. These agreements are often described using the Latin word foederati, meaning allies bound by a treaty. In theory, federate groups provided soldiers to Rome in exchange for land, payments, supplies, or a recognized place within the empire. It was a practical arrangement. Rome needed manpower. Powerful military communities wanted legal security and access to Roman wealth. But it also created new risks. A federate army might be loyal to Rome, but loyalty could depend on whether it was fed, paid, respected, and led well. Its commander might serve an emperor faithfully for years, then turn against him if negotiations broke down. And as the Western government grew weaker, it became increasingly dependent on exactly these kinds of forces. Roman armies had never been composed only of men born in Italy. The empire had always recruited widely. By the 5th century, though, commanders of Gothic, Frankish, Vandal, Alan, and other backgrounds were not merely serving at the edges of the system. They were becoming essential to it. They commanded troops, negotiated treaties, married into elite families, and competed in the dangerous politics of the imperial court. Meanwhile, the emperors were often fighting each other. This is one of the quiet engines behind the Western Empire's decline. Rome did not lose its provinces simply because foreign peoples appeared at the frontier. Foreign peoples had been appearing there for centuries. The difference was that the state had become increasingly divided and fragile. Generals raised armies to support their preferred emperor. Rival emperors fought civil wars. Troops that might have guarded the Rhine or protected a province were pulled away to fight other Romans, and every civil war taught ambitious commanders the same lesson. If you controlled an army, you could make an emperor, or remove one. Then, at the very end of 406, several groups crossed the Rhine frontier into Gaul. The traditional date is the last day of the year, though the precise circumstances remain debated. Perhaps the river had frozen. Perhaps Roman defences had been weakened by troops moving elsewhere. Perhaps the crossing was not one sudden event at all, but a longer movement remembered later as a single dramatic breach. Whatever exactly happened, the result was clear enough. Vandals, Suebi, Alans, and others moved into Gaul. Some fought Roman forces, some fought one another. Some made temporary arrangements with Roman authorities. Over the following years, many continued southwest into Hispania. Imagine being a farmer in Gaul during this period. You might hear rumours long before you saw anything yourself. A road unsafe beyond the next town. A local official demanding an emergency tax. Soldiers passing through, refugees, arriving with stories of burned estates. Then perhaps life settling down again for a season, because distant chaos did not always reach every village at once. That is one reason 476 can be misleading. For many communities, the decisive change came earlier. For others, later. Some places suffered raids, lost tax revenue, or saw military protection vanish. Others continued growing crops, attending church, bringing disputes before local officials, and using Roman coins long after imperial authority had weakened. The Burgundians offer another example of this complicated process. They entered the Roman world in stages, suffered military defeat, and were eventually settled by Roman authorities in parts of southeastern Gaul. There they became allies, landholders, and eventually rulers of a kingdom that still used Roman laws and Roman administrators. The Franks were settled closer to the Rhine frontier. Some Frankish leaders served Rome for generations. They defended territory, commanded Roman troops, and gained influence within northern Gaul. When imperial power faded, they did not arrive in an empty land and replace everything overnight. They expanded through a landscape already filled with Roman towns, bishops, landowners, soldiers, and local communities making difficult accommodations. The same was true of the Visigoths. After their earlier conflicts with Rome, they were settled in parts of the empire, first in the Balkans and later in Gaul. Their kings could be dangerous rivals to Roman authority. They could also be indispensable partners. The relationship shifted constantly, depending on who needed whom most at a given moment. So when we say that Goths, Vandals, Suebi, Burgundians and Franks entered the Western Empire, we should picture movement, certainly, but not a single wave sweeping away a helpless civilization. Picture instead thousands of separate decisions, a commander making a treaty, a family abandoning an exposed farm, a bishop negotiating with a new king, a Roman landowner deciding whether to cooperate, flee, or wait, a soldier changing employers because one side could still pay him. By 476, this process had been underway for generations. Odoacer himself was part of that world. He was not an alien force descending on Rome from nowhere. He commanded soldiers already employed in Italy, many of them men from federate backgrounds who wanted land and reward for their service. When the Western government could not satisfy them, they chose a new leader, and that is why the removal of Romulus Augustulus felt less like the beginning of a catastrophe than another turn in a long, exhausting political struggle. The old imperial machinery was still there, but it was being operated by new hands, for new purposes, in a world that had already been changing for a very long time. But if the Western Empire was changing so slowly and in so many different ways, there is another question waiting underneath all the political drama. How many people were actually living through it? When we speak about Rome falling, it is easy to picture a vast population simply vanishing into darkness. Millions of Romans gone, cities emptied, farms abandoned, roads silent, a civilization erased, but history is almost never that tidy. The short answer is that we do not know exactly how many people lived in the Roman West around the year 400, or around 476, or a century later. The Roman state counted many things. It counted taxpayers. It counted grain shipments. It counted soldiers where its paperwork still functioned. It counted land, at least when officials needed to know what could be taxed. But it did not leave us a reliable empire-wide population census in the modern sense. No official stood at every door, asking how many people slept inside. No surviving document tells us the total population of Italy, Gaul, Hispania, Britain, and North Africa at the moment the Western emperors disappeared. So historians have to work indirectly. They look at ancient censuses, although these usually counted citizens, households, or taxpayers rather than every man, woman, child, enslaved person, migrant, and visitor. They study tax records where they survive, trying to work out how much land was being cultivated and how many people might have worked it. They map settlements, villas, villages, farms, cemeteries, and abandoned fields. They examine pollen trapped in lakes and marshes, because pollen can reveal whether forests were spreading over former farmland, or whether grain cultivation continued. Even graves can help, though not as simply as you might think. A cemetery tells us that people died there. It may reveal age, health, diet, injury, and disease, but it does not tell us everyone who lived nearby. Many people were buried elsewhere. Some graves have vanished. Some communities used burial grounds we have not found, and wealthier or more visible groups often leave better traces than the poor. This means every number comes with a warning. Still, historians can make cautious estimates. The western half of the Roman world may have contained somewhere in the range of 20 to 30 million people during the later 4th and early 5th centuries. Some estimates go lower, some go higher. Everything depends on where the boundaries are drawn, which date is chosen, and how much confidence we place in the surviving evidence. But whatever the exact number, it was not a small world. Italy alone probably contained several million people. Gaul, stretching across most of modern France and beyond, held several million more. Hispania, roughly modern Spain and Portugal, was densely settled in many regions. Roman North Africa, especially the provinces of modern Tunisia and neighbouring coastal areas, was one of the most productive and urbanised parts of the Western Empire. Britain, farther away and less densely populated than some Mediterranean regions, still had perhaps a few million inhabitants before the end of Roman rule. These were not all living in cities. In fact, most people in the Roman West lived where most people had always lived, in the countryside. They grew wheat, olives, grapes, beans, barley, vegetables, and fodder for animals. They tended sheep, goats, pigs, cattle, and chickens. They lived on estates, in villages, beside roads, near small market towns, and in isolated farmsteads whose names have been forgotten for 1,500 years. The population of the Western Empire was spread unevenly, shaped by soil, rainfall, trade routes, old patterns of settlement, and the demands of taxation. Italy was special, but not necessarily because it was overflowing with people. It had Rome, still an enormous city by ancient standards even after its decline. It had Ravenna, Milan, Naples, Aquileia, and countless smaller towns. It had wealthy estates and long-developed farmland. But Italy was also politically exposed. Armies marched through it. Rival rulers fought over it. Its food supply, especially for Rome, had long depended partly on grain arriving by sea from North Africa. Gaul had rich agricultural zones, major river valleys, busy towns, and old networks of roads and trade. The Rhône, the Loire, the Seine, and the Garonne connected communities over great distances. Some parts of Gaul were heavily settled, particularly the more fertile and Romanized regions in the south and east. Other areas, especially uplands, forests, and more remote northern districts, were less densely populated. Hispania was equally varied. Its coasts and river valleys supported prosperous towns, mines, olive groves, vineyards, and grain fields. But much of the peninsula was rugged, dry, or difficult to farm intensively. Roman life was never distributed evenly across it. A wealthy estate in the Guadalquivir Valley existed in a different world from a mountain community in the northwest. Britain stood at the edge of the Roman system. It had towns, villas, forts, markets, and productive farmland, especially in the south and east. Yet it was also more thinly urbanized than Italy or North Africa. Its economy depended heavily on military spending and the presence of the Roman army. When imperial structures withdrew in the early 5th century, the effects could be especially sharp in places built around forts, garrisons, and official supply networks. And then there was North Africa. To many Romans, Africa was not a distant desert. It was a vital heartland. The coastal provinces around Carthage produced grain, olive oil, pottery, and other goods on a massive scale. Carthage itself was one of the greatest cities in the Western Empire. Its countryside was full of estates, villages, and market centres linked to Mediterranean trade. If you wanted to understand why the loss of North Africa to the Vandals in the 5th century mattered so much, population is part of the answer. This was not an empty fringe. It was a wealthy, productive region that supported large communities and helped feed cities far beyond its own shores. So, did all these regions experience population decline after the 4th century? Probably in some places, certainly not in exactly the same way, at exactly the same time. There is evidence of contraction in many parts of the West. Some towns shrank, some villas were abandoned or transformed. Some rural settlements disappeared from the archaeological record. Long-distance trade became less regular in certain regions. Wars disrupted harvests. Taxation could become crushing. Armies consumed supplies. Raids drove people from exposed areas. Disease, though difficult to measure before the great plagues of later centuries, was always present in crowded and mobile societies. And yet decline was not the whole story. A settlement disappearing does not always mean its people died. They may have moved downhill, closer to a church, a fortified hilltop, a new road, a safer water source, or the estate of a powerful local patron. A Roman villa may vanish from the record because its owners stopped displaying wealth in the old Roman way, not because every family on the land disappeared. A town might lose its baths, forums, and public monuments, while remaining inhabited. It might become smaller, poorer, more defensible, and more focused around a bishop's church. From above, it could look like collapse. From inside, it could feel more like adaptation. This is one of the hardest things to remember when looking at late antiquity. Archaeology often sees buildings. It sees coins, pottery, graves, walls, and broken roof tiles. But people are more flexible than buildings. A government office can vanish. A bathhouse can fall into disuse. A grand villa can be divided into smaller homes. None of that means the local population has ceased to exist. It means the old pattern has changed. There may have been broad demographic decline across parts of the Western Empire between the high point of Roman power and the early medieval centuries. Many historians think so. The scale, causes, and timing remain debated. In some regions, the decline may have begun before 476. In others, it may have accelerated only after war, political fragmentation, or economic disruption. And in some local areas, there may have been stability, recovery, or even growth. That is why the question cannot be answered with one dramatic number. Millions did not disappear from the historical record because they had been killed, or because they had fled into some mysterious wilderness, or because they suddenly stopped being Roman. Most people simply became harder to see. The empire had produced documents because it taxed, recruited, judged, supplied, and governed on a huge scale. When that machinery weakened, the paperwork thinned out. Fewer records survive. Fewer coins were minted in some places. Fewer inscriptions were carved. Local communities left quieter traces. But quieter is not the same as empty. The farmers still planted when they could. Parents still raised children. Villages still argued over land, water, inheritance, and marriage. People still travelled to markets, still prayed in churches, still buried their dead, still remembered which family owned which field. The Western Empire did not lose millions of people in a single moment. It lost much of its ability to count them. And to find those people, we have to leave the imperial palaces, the city gates, and the great roads for a while. We have to go out into the countryside, because this was where most Romans lived. Not in Rome, not in Ravenna, not in Arles, Carthage, Toledo, or Trier. Most people lived among fields, vineyards, pasture land, orchards, and small clusters of houses. They lived close to the work that kept everyone else alive. They woke before sunrise. They watched the weather. They knew which patch of soil held moisture after a dry spring, which stream could be trusted in late summer, which hillside was good for vines, which field exhausted itself if it was planted too often. Their world was measured less by the years of emperors than by the cycle of ploughing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, threshing, pressing, lambing, and winter repair. For millions of people, the fall of the Western Empire did not arrive as a single date. It arrived, if it arrived at all, in changes to who demanded taxes, who passed through with soldiers, who controlled the nearby town, and whether the harvest could be moved safely to market. The basic work remained. Grain was at the centre of it, wheat where conditions allowed it, but also barley, millet, rye in some northern and upland regions, and pulses such as beans and lentils. Grain made bread and porridge. It fed households, labourers, animals, towns, armies, and tax collectors. A poor harvest could mean hunger almost immediately. A good harvest might provide enough surplus to pay rent, settle a debt, buy a tool, or survive the next difficult year. But the Roman countryside was never just endless wheat fields. In Mediterranean regions, vineyards covered suitable slopes and plains. Wine was not a luxury only for the rich. It was part of ordinary diet, religious practice, hospitality, trade, and daily routine. Olive trees provided oil for cooking, lamps, washing, and preservation. Sheep gave wool, milk, cheese, and meat. Goats thrived on rougher land where crops struggled. Pigs turned woodland and household scraps into food. Cattle pulled ploughs and carts, though owning a good ox team was beyond the reach of many poor families. Chickens, gardens, fruit trees, and beehives added small but important layers of security. A rural household tried not to depend on only one thing. That was sensible. A farmer whose wheat failed might still have goats. A family with a small vineyard might trade wine for grain. A village with access to woodland could gather fuel, nuts, timber, and forage. A household near the coast or a river might fish. None of this removed the danger of famine. But it gave people options, and options mattered in a world where one bad season could change everything. Some rural people owned land, others rented it, others worked for wages when work was available. Many lived on large estates, farming plots assigned to them while owing rent, labour, produce, or some mixture of all three to a landowner. There were enslaved workers too, especially on certain estates and in households, although the exact scale and changing forms of slavery varied greatly from region to region. The Roman countryside was not divided neatly into free peasants on one side and enslaved labourers on the other. Real life was more complicated. A tenant might be legally free, but deeply dependent on a landlord. A smallholder might own a few fields yet owe taxes he could barely pay. A labourer might move from estate to estate at harvest time. A prosperous local family might own enough land to employ neighbours, lend grain in hard years, and exercise influence far beyond its official rank. And over time, that local influence became more important. Under the empire, the state had reached deeply into rural life. It assessed land. It demanded taxes. It requisitioned supplies. It regulated transport and collected grain. In theory, a farmer in a remote valley was connected to the emperor through a long chain of officials: land registers, local councils, tax collectors, soldiers, and landlords. In practice, that chain was never equally strong everywhere. But in the 4th and 5th centuries, it could still be heavy. Taxation was one of the great pressures of late Roman life. The empire needed money and food for armies, administration, roads, fortifications, and the enormous machinery of government. Taxes could be paid in coin, but often in kind as well: grain, wine, oil, animals, cloth, or labour. The burden did not always fall fairly. Wealthy landowners often had more ways to negotiate, delay, shift costs, or use connections. Smaller farmers had fewer. A peasant might not care whether the ruler was called emperor, king, patrician, or general. But he cared whether the collector came twice. He cared whether soldiers took his grain. He cared whether a war interrupted the harvest. He cared whether the road to the market town was safe. This is where the political collapse of the West became real. Not always as fire and massacre, sometimes as uncertainty. Suppose you were farming in central Gaul around the year 470. You may have heard that Roman authority was weakening. You may have known that a military commander, a Gothic king, or a local magnate now held power in the region. But your immediate questions were simpler. Would the same estate manager demand rent? Would the village church still receive its offerings? Would the local strongman protect the district from raiders, or become another source of demands? Could you still exchange your surplus grain for salt, pottery, iron tools, or cloth? Those small exchanges were essential. Even villages that looked self-sufficient depended on networks beyond the village. Salt might come from a distant coast or mine. Millstones could travel long distances from particular quarries. Iron tools required specialist production. Pottery moved through local and regional markets. Wine, oil, fish sauce, textiles, and fine ceramics might come from farther away, especially in wealthier and better connected regions. The great Mediterranean trade system did not simply vanish in 476. In many places, goods continued to move. North African pottery and olive oil containers still reached parts of Italy and Gaul. Eastern Mediterranean imports still appeared in western ports. But trade became less predictable in some regions, more dependent on local conditions, and more vulnerable to war and changing political boundaries. For a rural family, that might mean something as ordinary as repairing an old tool instead of buying a new one, reusing a broken amphora, wearing a garment longer, making more goods at home, buying local pottery rather than imported tableware. Small adjustments, quiet adjustments. The archaeological record shows them everywhere. Roman villas, for example, did not all share one fate. Some were abandoned, some were damaged during periods of conflict. Some stopped being grand residences and became working agricultural centres. Reception rooms might be divided by rough walls, mosaics might be covered, damaged, or simply ignored. Barns, workshops, storage spaces, and smaller dwellings could appear within what had once been an elite complex. From one perspective, this looks like decline, and sometimes it was. A family that could once afford marble, mosaics, heated baths and imported luxuries no longer could. The old aristocratic lifestyle had become too expensive, too dangerous, or simply less meaningful. From another perspective, a transformed villa could still be full of life. People may have continued planting the surrounding fields. Animals still needed tending, grain still needed storing, grapes still needed pressing, children still grew up there, learned the boundaries of fields, carried water, fed chickens, and listened to adults discuss the weather and the rent. The building changed because the society around it changed. Villages show the same pattern of continuity and adaptation. Some long-established settlements remained occupied. Others shifted location. People might move from scattered farms into a more concentrated settlement near a church, a fortified hilltop, a defensible enclosure, or a reliable source of water. In some places, the old Roman road still organised settlement. In others, communities drew inward, choosing safety over easy access to distant markets. This can make the countryside seem emptier to archaeologists than it really was. A stone villa leaves a clear mark. A timber house, a modest hut, or a cluster of reused buildings can be much harder to find 15 centuries later. When the visible Roman structures disappear, the people using the land do not necessarily disappear with them. They may simply be living differently, and increasingly they were living under the shadow of powerful local landholders. As imperial administration weakened, men who controlled land, armed followers, storehouses, and connections became indispensable. They could offer protection, they could settle disputes, they could provide loans of seed grain after a failed harvest. They could speak to officials or new rulers on behalf of a community. But protection was never free. The same landholder who defended tenants might demand labour. The same patron who offered grain might bind a family to debt. The same local noble who preserved order might make himself harder to challenge than any distant tax official had been. This did not happen everywhere at the same speed. It was not one sudden invention of feudalism on the ruins of Rome. That later system would develop slowly and differently across Europe. But the direction is visible. In a more fragmented political world, security became local. Power became more personal. Land became even more important. And yet, for the person behind a plough, there was also a strange kind of continuity. The sky still governed the harvest. The soil still had to be turned. The vines still had to be pruned, sheep still wandered. Children still had to be fed through winter. A new king in Ravenna or Toulouse could matter enormously, especially if his armies arrived nearby. But for many rural Romans, government changed hands at a distance before it changed life on the ground. The old empire was fading. The countryside kept working, not untouched, not safe, not unchanged, but alive. And those rural families, however distant they were from imperial politics, still depended on towns and cities. Not everyone needed Rome itself, very few did, but almost everyone lived within reach, however difficult that reach could be, of some urban centre. A walled town, an old colony, a market settlement, a former provincial capital, a port, a bishop's seat. This was where grain could be sold, disputes could be heard, tools could be bought, taxes could be assessed, and news arrived from the wider world. So when the Western Empire weakened, the fate of its cities mattered enormously. And this is where the story can become misleading. People often imagine Roman cities falling silent all at once. Forums empty, baths cold, theatres abandoned, streets filling with weeds as everyone fled to the countryside. There is some truth in that picture. In many places, public buildings did decline. Some were dismantled for stone. Some collapsed. Some were no longer repaired when roofs leaked, columns cracked, or water systems failed. But a declining monument is not the same thing as a dead city. A forum could stop being the grand ceremonial centre of Roman civic life and still remain a useful open space. A bathhouse could close because its complex heating system was expensive to maintain, while the surrounding neighbourhood stayed crowded. A theatre could no longer host imperial celebrations, but its arcades might shelter workshops, storage rooms, houses, animals, or small markets. The stones remained, and people found new ways to use them. Picture a medium-sized Roman town in the late 5th century. 200 years earlier, it may have had broad paved streets, a formal forum lined with statues, public baths heated by furnaces, temples, administrative offices, and an amphitheatre capable of holding thousands. By the year 500, much of that old arrangement may no longer work. The city council, the curia, had once been responsible for local taxes, building repairs, festivals, and public services. Wealthy citizens competed for honour by funding fountains, baths, monuments, and games. That was part of what it meant to be Roman. A city was not just a place where people lived. It was a stage on which civic pride was displayed. But by the 5th century, the old civic system was under immense pressure. Local elites often tried to avoid the costly obligations of city office. Tax demands were heavy, political authority was shifting, military emergencies consumed resources, and the institutions that had supported public life no longer had the money, confidence, or stability they once possessed. A fountain stopped running. A roof went unrepaired. A statue was taken down, melted, or left standing with its inscription slowly becoming unreadable. This was real loss. For people used to the old Roman world, it must have been visible everywhere. But it was not necessarily emptiness. Archaeology gives us a more complicated picture. In city after city, the evidence shows buildings changing function rather than simply vanishing. Large rooms were divided into smaller spaces with rough walls. Porticos that once offered shaded walks became market stalls. Former public buildings acquired hearths, ovens, storage pits, and work areas. Old paving stones were lifted and reused. Marble from temples and civic monuments was turned into lime, building material or decoration for newer structures. To an aristocrat writing about the decay of civilization, this might have looked terrible. To a potter, a baker, a metal worker, or a family looking for shelter, it may have looked practical. An abandoned bath complex had thick walls, solid floors, and rooms already arranged around water channels. It could become housing. It could become a warehouse. It could become a workshop where iron was forged, glass was recycled, or pottery was fired. In some places, people buried their dead in or beside buildings that had once been central to public life. This was not because everyone had forgotten what those structures were. Often they knew perfectly well, but the old boundaries between sacred, civic, commercial, and domestic space were changing. The Roman city was being rearranged from the inside. Churches became especially important in this new arrangement. Before Christianity became dominant, a Roman city had been defined by its forum, temples, baths, theatres, law courts, and monuments to emperors. In the post-Roman West, the bishop's church increasingly became the place around which urban life gathered. It was a house of worship, of course, but it could also be a meeting place, a source of charity, a storehouse, a place where legal disputes were discussed, where travellers found assistance, and where local communities could appeal to a figure of authority when older civic institutions had weakened. A bishop was not simply a priest in a large building. He might be one of the few people in the city who could write official letters, negotiate with rulers, organise relief during a shortage, ransom captives after a raid, or use church wealth to repair walls and buildings. The role varied greatly from city to city, but in many places, bishops inherited parts of the public importance once held by Roman magistrates. That did not mean cities became peaceful little communities organised around churches. They could still be places of conflict, poverty, disease, crowding and rivalry. They could be attacked, taxed, occupied, or cut off from trade. But the church provided an institution that survived political change remarkably well. It connected a local town to a wider network, stretching across kingdoms and, in theory at least, across the old Roman world. And cities that had strong churches, defensible positions, productive hinterlands, good ports, or continuing administrative importance often endured better than others. Rome itself had shrunk dramatically from its imperial peak. The exact numbers are uncertain, and estimates vary widely. But there is little doubt that the city had far fewer inhabitants by the 6th century than it had during the High Empire. The vast grain distributions, huge building programs, and immense imperial bureaucracy that had supported its population were no longer what they had been. Yet Rome did not disappear. It still had senators, clergy, artisans, labourers, merchants, pilgrims, poor households, old families, newcomers, and people living among the ruins of structures their grandparents may still have remembered in use. Its aqueduct system suffered. Some neighbourhoods became sparse. Great spaces once filled by imperial crowds became quieter. But the city remained a powerful symbol, a religious centre, and eventually the home of a bishop whose authority would become increasingly significant. Other major cities showed similar resilience for different reasons. Ravenna remained important because kings and imperial officials had made it a capital. Its marshy setting offered protection, and its links to the Adriatic helped sustain it. Arles in southern Gaul held on to importance through its river connections, roads, administration, and church. Marseille remained tied to Mediterranean trade. Carthage under Vandal rule and later Byzantine reconquest continued to be one of the great cities of North Africa, though its fortunes depended heavily on politics, shipping and war. These places changed, but they still mattered. Smaller towns were more vulnerable. A modest inland settlement that had depended on a nearby estate economy, a functioning tax system, a regular market, or the spending of local officials could fade when those supports weakened. Its walls might remain, but fewer people lived inside them. Its forum might become pasture, gardens, or a cemetery. Its public buildings might be quarried until only foundations survived. Sometimes settlement shifted outside the old Roman walls, closer to a church, a river crossing, a fortified hill, or better farmland. From a distance, this can look like abandonment, but archaeology asks a more careful question. Abandoned by whom, for how long, and replaced by what? A city centre may leave fewer coins and imported ceramics than it once did, suggesting that long-distance trade had contracted. But nearby, archaeologists may find cooking pots, animal bones, hearths, handmade goods, reused tiles, grain storage, and modest houses. These are not the remains of a vanished population. They are the remains of people living with fewer resources, different habits, and less need for the expensive public spaces of the Roman past. The evidence is often frustratingly incomplete. Stone buildings survive better than timber ones. Rich households leave more visible traces than poor ones. A collapsed monument is easy to notice. A family living in a partitioned room repairing old tools and cooking over a small hearth is much harder to recover from the ground. But those families were there. They were selling bread in old arcades, making shoes in rooms once used by officials, keeping animals in the outer spaces of an amphitheatre, building churches near former temples, carrying water from wells when aqueducts no longer worked, raising children in cities whose maps still looked Roman, even as the life inside them became something new. The urban world of the Western Empire did not simply end in 476. It became smaller in many places, poorer in some, more local, more improvised, less able to maintain the grand public machinery that had made Roman cities famous. But smaller is not the same as gone, and the people living among those old walls still needed food, tools, cloth, fuel, coin, and news from beyond the horizon, which meant that even a changing city remained tied to the networks that fed it. And those networks, like the cities themselves, were more fragile than they had once been. For centuries, the Roman world had moved food on a scale that was almost easy to take for granted. A farmer in North Africa harvested wheat. Labourers carried it to an estate storehouse. Officials assessed what was owed. Merchants, contractors and ship owners moved the grain to a harbour. Huge cargo ships crossed the Mediterranean, following seasonal winds and familiar routes. At Ostia, the port of Rome, grain was unloaded into warehouses. From there it could feed bakers, soldiers, officials, labourers, and, for much of the empire's history, people entitled to public distributions. It was an enormous system, and like most enormous systems, it depended on many small parts continuing to work at the same time. Taxes had to be collected, roads had to remain passable, ports needed workers, warehouses, officials, and security. Ships needed crews, timber, rope, sails, credit, and predictable markets. The sea itself was dangerous enough. Storms, shipwrecks, and pirates had never vanished completely. But the Roman state helped make the risks manageable. It created demand, it protected major routes, it coordinated the movement of supplies. And above all, it had the administrative reach to turn taxes gathered in one region into food, pay, and military power somewhere else. This was one of the hidden foundations of empire. Rome had never been economically self-sufficient. Neither were many other cities. Cities concentrated people who did not grow their own food. Officials, artisans, dock workers, teachers, clergy, soldiers, shopkeepers, builders, and the poor. They depended on grain arriving from the countryside around them, but the largest cities depended on much more than that. Rome especially had long relied on grain shipped across the sea. Egypt was crucial during the High Empire. North Africa became increasingly important too, particularly the fertile provinces around Carthage and the great estates of what are now Tunisia and parts of Algeria. African grain fed people far from African fields, and it was not only grain. The Mediterranean carried olive oil in amphorae, those tall ceramic containers with pointed bases designed for ships and storage yards. It carried wine from Italy, Gaul, Hispania, and Africa. It carried salted fish, sauces, textiles, metals, glass, timber, spices, and slaves. It carried fine pottery for dining tables and plain pottery for kitchens. It carried marble, roof tiles, lamps, tools, and letters. A broken piece of imported pottery found in a distant settlement may seem like a very small thing, but it can tell us that somebody, somewhere, still had access to a chain of exchange stretching across hundreds of miles. One of the most recognizable signs of this system is African red slipware. This was fine table pottery made in North Africa and exported in extraordinary quantities during the late Roman period. Archaeologists find it in Italy, Gaul, Hispania, Britain, and across the Mediterranean. Its bright red surface appears in villas, towns, forts, and rural settlements. It was not necessarily luxury wear in the modern sense. Some pieces were probably affordable to people of modest means, but its wide distribution reveals something important. North African workshops were making standardized goods for distant markets. A family in southern Gaul might eat from a bowl made near Carthage. A merchant in Italy might sell oil shipped from an African estate. A church community in a coastal town might light lamps fueled by oil that had crossed the sea in the hold of a cargo vessel. The empire was not one economy in the modern sense. It had no central bank, no container ports, no instant communication, no single uniform market. Transport was slow, prices varied, local shortages could be severe even in prosperous times. Most people still lived close to the land, producing much of what they needed nearby. But Roman rule had linked regions together more tightly than before. Then political control fragmented. And this did not mean that every ship stopped sailing in 476. That is one of the simplest stories, and one of the least useful. The Western Emperor was removed in Italy, but merchants did not receive a message saying trade was over. Farmers still planted wheat. Potters still fired kilns. Sailors still knew the winds. Ports still existed. The Mediterranean did not suddenly become an empty sea. In fact, trade continued in many places well into the late 5th and 6th centuries. African pottery still reached Italy. Eastern Mediterranean goods still appeared in western ports. Wine, oil, and ceramics continued to move. Some new rulers actively preserved Roman systems because they needed the taxes, the food supply, and the prestige those systems could provide. But the old network was becoming less reliable. A unified imperial government had once coordinated taxation, military protection, and supply across vast territories. Now Italy, Gaul, Hispania, North Africa, and Britain were controlled by competing powers or contested by them. A route that crossed one administrative world might now cross several. A merchant could face new tolls, new officials, new currencies, new military checkpoints, or no protection at all. War made everything harder. Armies consumed food. They seized animals, grain, carts, and labour. They disrupted planting and harvests. A city under siege could not simply wait for ships to arrive. A port caught between rival fleets might lose access to goods on which its people had depended. Even when no battle happened nearby, uncertainty had its own cost. If a shipowner feared confiscation, raiding, or a changing ruler who might refuse payment, he might not risk a voyage. The system did not need to be destroyed everywhere to become weaker. It only needed to become less predictable, and the most important disruption came with North Africa. When the Vandals took Carthage in 439, they gained control of one of the wealthiest and most productive parts of the Western Empire. They also gained access to the African grain and oil trade that had helped sustain Italy and Rome. The Vandal kingdom did not shut down African agriculture. Carthage remained a major city. African ceramics and other goods continued to circulate. But the flow of resources was no longer directed by the Western imperial government in the same way. Italy had lost a vital piece of the machinery that supported it. For the people of Rome, this mattered deeply. The city could still receive supplies, and its food sources were never limited to one province alone. But its old privileged position was harder to maintain. A capital that no longer controlled the taxes of a vast empire could not feed itself with the same confidence. Meanwhile, in many inland regions, long-distance goods became less common. Archaeologists often see this in the changing pattern of pottery. Imported fine wares decline at some sites. Amphorae from distant regions become rarer. Coin finds thin out. In their place, there may be more locally made vessels, often simpler in form and produced on a smaller scale. people used wooden containers, leather bags, baskets, and old pottery repaired again and again. These leave much less evidence in the ground than a shipload of imported amphorae. So the disappearance of a particular kind of pottery does not mean people stopped eating, drinking, or exchanging goods. It means the way they obtained those goods was changing. A town that once received oil from Africa might rely more heavily on nearby producers. A rural household might make its own coarse pots, trade with a neighbouring village, or buy from a regional market rather than a merchant connected to the Mediterranean. Landowners may have looked increasingly to local estates for grain, wine, animals, and labour. Communities became more dependent on the resources within reach of a cart, a riverboat, or a day's walk. This was economic simplification, but it was not identical everywhere. Coastal Italy remained connected to sea routes more easily than an isolated settlement in inland Gaul. Marseille continued to function as a port. Parts of southern Hispania retained Mediterranean links. North Africa itself remained deeply involved in production and exchange under Vandal rule. In some regions, old patterns survived longer than historians once assumed. In others, especially places already distant from major roads, ports, and wealthy cities, the contraction was sharper. The Roman economy was not replaced by silence. It became patchier, more regional, more cautious, more dependent on local relationships and smaller markets, and less able to move vast quantities of food, goods, and wealth across political boundaries without interruption. And beneath all of this was another problem. Trade could continue without an emperor, but the old system also depended on something more abstract than ships, grain, or pottery. It depended on money moving reliably from hand to hand. And in much of the Western world, that flow was beginning to slow. Money is easy to overlook when it is working. A coin passes from a farmer to a market seller, from a market seller to a tax collector, from a tax collector to an official, from an official to a soldier. The soldier buys bread, sandals, wine, repairs for his equipment. The people who provide those things spend the coins again. And all the while a portion of this movement flows back toward the state. That was one of the engines of the Roman world. The empire collected taxes in many forms. Land taxes were especially important. So were customs duties, special levies and obligations placed on communities. Some taxes were paid in coin, others were paid in kind: grain, oil, animals, clothing, transport animals, or labour. The Roman state had always used both systems. A farmer might not see a pile of silver coins at harvest time. He might see officials measuring grain. But coinage helped connect all these different obligations. Taxes collected in one place could become wages somewhere else. Grain gathered from an estate could feed an army. Coin could pay the soldiers guarding a frontier, the clerks keeping records, the builders repairing walls, and the messengers carrying orders. It allowed a government to turn resources into action across long distances. And soldiers were central to this. The late Roman army was not simply a band of warriors who lived off whatever they could seize. Soldiers expected regular support. They received food, equipment, and often pay. Their officers needed records. Forts needed repairs. Horses needed fodder. Weapons needed metalworkers. An army was an expensive institution, and the Roman tax system existed in large part because armies were expensive. As long as taxes could be assessed, gathered, transported, and redistributed, the machine could keep moving. But after the Western Empire fragmented, that movement became more difficult. The new kingdoms that emerged in Italy, Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa did not arrive in an empty landscape. They inherited Roman roads, cities, estates, tax registers, officials, laws, and habits of government. Many of their rulers understood very clearly that Roman administration was useful. Theodoric, the Ostrogothic king of Italy, employed Roman officials and preserved much of the old fiscal structure. The Visigoths in Hispania issued law codes in Latin and governed large Roman populations. Frankish kings collected revenues and used former imperial institutions where they could. Vandal rulers in North Africa took control of wealthy estates and the taxes connected to them. Nobody sensible wanted to throw away a functioning source of income. But preserving a system is not the same as preserving the conditions that made it work. The Western imperial government had once drawn revenue from an enormous territory. It could shift resources between provinces. If one region was damaged by war, another might help support the army. If Italy needed grain, African taxes and shipments could be directed there. If a frontier was threatened, officials could mobilize supplies from far away. A successor kingdom usually controlled less land, fewer taxpayers, and fewer secure trade routes. Its ruler also faced a different political problem. He needed to reward followers, military commanders, local allies, royal officials, and powerful landowners. One practical way to do this was not with a regular salary paid in coin, but with land, rights to collect income, or a share of local revenues. This was not a sudden invention of the post-Roman world. Roman emperors had granted land and privileges too. Payment in goods had always existed. Personal dependence had always mattered. But as the old tax network weakened, these arrangements became more important. Instead of money moving through a large state system, wealth could become tied more closely to particular places. A lord might support retainers from the produce of an estate. A soldier might receive land, or the income from tenants living on it. A local official might be compensated through rights to collect dues. A village might owe transport, labour on a bridge, grain for a garrison, or animals for an army passing through. These were still forms of taxation and payment. They simply did not always involve coins. The archaeological evidence gives us a quiet sign of this transformation. In several Western regions, especially from the later 5th century onward, small bronze coins become much less common in excavated sites. These were the coins useful for everyday transactions. A little food, a lamp, a small service, perhaps a visit to a market stall. Their decline does not mean that all money vanished. Gold coins continued to be minted and used by kings, aristocrats, churches and merchants. Silver also circulated in various forms. Old Roman coins remained in use for a long time. In some regions, new rulers issued coins that deliberately resembled imperial ones, preserving familiar images and claims to authority. But gold was not especially useful for buying onions, repairing a pot, or paying a neighbour for a day of work. For ordinary exchange, small change mattered, and when fewer small coins were available, people had to find other ways to manage daily life. They could barter goods directly. They could keep informal accounts. I give you grain now, and you owe me labour at harvest. They could rely on credit within a village, a household, a monastery, or an estate. They could pay rents and dues with chickens, wine, wool, firewood, or days of work. These arrangements worked best among people who knew one another. That was their strength, and also their limit. A farmer could trust a neighbour, a landlord, or a local merchant whose family had lived nearby for generations. But it was harder to make such arrangements with a stranger from 200 miles away. Coinage had never removed all risk from trade, yet a widely recognised coin gave people a simple way to agree on value, without needing a personal relationship. As coin became scarcer in some places, local relationships became more important. For a household, this could make life feel smaller. Not necessarily poorer in every respect. A family with access to land, animals, kin, and a stable local community could still endure. They grew food, made clothing, repaired tools, exchanged surplus at nearby markets, and relied on obligations that had meaning because everyone understood them. But their world was more vulnerable to local failure. A bad harvest could no longer be offset as easily by supplies arriving through a broad imperial network. A local strongman could demand labour or food with little effective appeal beyond the region. A family without land, animals, or powerful relatives might find its options narrowing. Instead of earning coin and choosing what to buy, it might owe work. Instead of selling produce in a distant market, it might surrender a portion directly to an estate. The old Roman system had never been gentle. Taxes could be heavy. Officials could be corrupt. Soldiers could be burdensome. For many peasants, imperial administration was not a comforting abstraction. It was a collector at the door, but it had created a vast framework in which money, food, authority, and military service could circulate. Now that framework was breaking into smaller pieces. And in those smaller pieces, new rulers had to answer an urgent question. How do you govern Roman people using Roman habits when the empire that once held those habits together is gone? The answer, at least at first, was not to govern them as strangers. It was to govern them as Romans had been governed before. That sounds surprising because the story is often told as a clean replacement. Rome falls, barbarians arrive, the old population disappears, and a new world begins. But that is not what most people living in the western provinces would have seen. They would have seen new men at the top, a Gothic king in Italy, a Vandal king in North Africa, Burgundian kings along the Rhone Valley, Frankish kings in northern Gaul, Suevic kings in the northwest of Hispania. Some spoke different languages, some followed different forms of Christianity. Many came from military communities with their own leaders, traditions and ideas about honour. But below them were still the same farmers, planting the same fields. The same town councils, though often weaker than before. The same bishops writing letters in Latin. The same landowners managing estates. The same clerks who knew how to calculate taxes, draft contracts, preserve legal records, and make government work. The new kings needed those people. A ruler could win a battle with warriors. He could not easily assess land, settle inheritance disputes, organize grain supplies, or govern a city without people who understood the old machinery. Roman administration had been built over centuries. Its paperwork, customs, and legal language were not something a new kingdom could simply invent over a winter. So the successor kings borrowed. They used Roman officials. They issued documents in Latin. They collected taxes, even if less consistently and over smaller territories than the imperial government had done. They repaired roads when they could, protected markets when it served them, and presented themselves not only as conquerors, but as guardians of order. The Goths were especially clear about this. In Italy and southern Gaul, Gothic rulers inherited populations that were overwhelmingly Roman in language and daily life. Their kings often ruled through Roman ministers and administrators. In the early 6th century, Theodoric the Ostrogoth employed highly educated Roman aristocrats such as Cassiodorus and Boethius. Official letters from his government used the polished language of Roman statecraft. The old Senate still met in Rome. Roman officials still held titles that had existed under emperors. The king was a Goth, but much of the government spoke Latin. In some places, separate legal traditions were preserved. Goths might be judged according to Gothic custom, while Romans continued under Roman law. This was not necessarily a simple racial division, as if everyone could be sorted neatly into two permanent boxes. Identity was messier than that, but the distinction mattered politically. It allowed a king to assure Roman subjects that their property, marriages, contracts and inheritance rights would not suddenly be judged by unfamiliar rules. The Burgundians did something similar. Their kingdom covered parts of what are now eastern France and western Switzerland. Burgundian kings issued laws for Burgundians, but they also produced a Roman law code for their Roman subjects. The very existence of two legal collections tells us something important. These rulers did not assume that one people had replaced another. They expected Burgundians and Romans to live beside one another, make disputes, own land, marry, trade, and require courts. The law had to deal with a mixed society because society was mixed. In Vandal North Africa, the situation was different and often harsher. The Vandals had captured Carthage and taken control of one of the wealthiest regions of the old Western Empire. Their kings seized estates from some Roman landowners and clashed bitterly with Nicene Catholic bishops, while the Vandals themselves generally followed Arian Christianity. That religious division could become a political danger. There were periods of confiscation, exile, and pressure on Catholic clergy, especially when Vandal kings feared Roman loyalties or internal opposition. Yet even there, the image of a tiny foreign people simply destroying Roman Africa is misleading. The kingdom depended on African farmers, African cities, African shipping, African tax practices, and Latin-speaking officials. Its coinage, administration, and urban life all retained important Roman features. The rulers had changed. The population had not vanished. In Gaul, Frankish kings eventually built the most durable of the Western kingdoms. But the Franks, too, ruled a land filled with Gallo-Romans. They relied on bishops, local aristocrats, and former imperial officials. Men trained in Roman law and rhetoric could become advisors, diplomats, tax collectors, and counts under Frankish rulers. Even the famous Frankish law code, the Salic law, was not a constitution for everybody living in Gaul. It was a law associated with Frankish communities. Roman legal traditions continued alongside it. A person's legal identity might depend partly on ancestry, family connections, local custom, and the court before which a case was heard. This was a world in which a man might be Roman by law, Frankish by military service, Christian by faith, and a citizen of a particular city by daily loyalty. And that is before we even consider language. Latin remained the language of administration, learning, law, and the church across much of the Western kingdoms. But spoken Latin was changing, region by region, slowly becoming the early forms of Romance languages. Germanic languages were spoken within royal households, military groups, and some settlements. In markets and villages, people must often have found practical ways to understand one another. A farmer did not need a theory of ethnic identity to sell wheat to a soldier. He needed a price, a measure, and some reason to trust that payment would arrive. There was cooperation. There was also conflict. Some newcomers received land or shares of revenue, and this could mean loss for existing landowners. Military settlement was not the same everywhere, and historians still debate its exact scale. In some regions, warriors may have been granted portions of tax income rather than entire farms. In others, land changed hands more directly. The evidence does not support one simple model for every kingdom, nor does it support the old image of millions of Romans being swept aside by a small barbarian elite. The newcomers were often a minority, their military power was real, and their kings could reshape the distribution of land, office, and wealth. But they governed provincial societies that remained mostly local, mostly Latin-speaking, and mostly descended from people who had lived under Rome for generations. Over time, boundaries could soften. Intermarriage happened, although it was sometimes discouraged by law or complicated by religious difference. Roman aristocrats could serve barbarian kings. Gothic or Frankish leaders could adopt Roman titles, wear Roman clothing, commission Latin inscriptions, and seek approval from Roman emperors in the East. A family might remember a Gothic grandfather, own a Roman-style villa, worship in a Catholic church, and serve a Frankish king. So what did it mean to be Roman now? For some it meant obeying Roman law. For others it meant speaking Latin, living in a city, belonging to the Catholic Church, or claiming descent from an old provincial family. For a bishop, Rome might mean a sacred and intellectual inheritance. For a tax collector, it might mean a set of records and procedures. For a farmer, it might mean very little beyond the language used in the market and the name of the ruler whose agents demanded grain. Political identity was no longer handed down from one enormous imperial centre. It was negotiated in courts, churches, estates, towns, and households. A person could belong to several worlds at once, and as those worlds overlapped, the old Roman West did not simply disappear. It became harder to recognize, divided among new kings, carried forward by old Romans, and changed a little more with every generation. Italy was where the old imperial story seemed most impossible to end. Rome itself was still there. Its walls still enclosed immense empty spaces, broken monuments, churches, markets, senatorial houses, gardens, workshops, and crowded neighbourhoods along the Tiber. The Senate still met. Roman officials still used old titles. People still spoke Latin, argued over property, visited baths when the pipes worked, and watched the grain ships with the same practical concern they had felt for centuries. And yet, in 476, the Western Emperor was gone. The young Emperor Romulus Augustulus had been removed by Odoacer, a military commander of Germanic background who had served within the Roman army in Italy. The event later became famous as the fall of Rome. But for people living through it, the change may have seemed less like a sudden collapse than another palace coup in a century full of them. Odoacer did not declare himself emperor. That was important. Instead, the Roman Senate sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople, the eastern capital, with a message that Italy no longer needed a separate Western emperor. One emperor in the east could in theory rule the whole Roman world. The Eastern Emperor Zeno did not entirely accept this simple arrangement. He still recognized Julius Nepos, a displaced Western emperor living across the Adriatic in Dalmatia, as the legitimate ruler of the West. But in practice, Odoacer governed Italy. His official title was patrician, a thoroughly Roman title with a long history. He minted coins in the name of the Eastern Emperor. He worked with the Senate. He maintained much of the administrative structure that had survived the 5th century. Taxes were still assessed. Legal documents were still produced. Roman aristocrats still held offices. The machinery was damaged, reduced, and operating under strain, but it had not been thrown away. This is one of the strangest things about 476. The empire in the West had ended as a political office, but many of its habits continued the next morning. For an Italian farmer, the ruler's name may have mattered less than whether a local official demanded taxes, whether soldiers passed through the district, whether the roads remained safe enough to bring produce to market, and whether a bad harvest would mean hunger. For a senator in Rome, Odoacer offered something equally valuable: order. Italy had suffered years of civil war, invasion, and competing emperors. Odoacer's rule, lasting from 476 to 493, was not peaceful in every corner, but it brought a degree of stability. He recovered Sicily from the Vandals through negotiation and payment. He extended power into Dalmatia after Julius Nepos was murdered in 480. He tried to present himself not as the destroyer of Roman Italy, but as its caretaker. Still, he was powerful enough to worry Constantinople. An Italian ruler with a loyal army, control of the peninsula, and influence over the Senate could become more than a patrician. Zeno needed a solution, and he found one in another Gothic leader waiting on the empire's frontier. His name was Theodoric. Theodoric was king of the Ostrogoths, a people who had spent decades moving through the Balkans, sometimes fighting the Eastern Empire, sometimes serving it. He had known Constantinople as a hostage in his youth. He understood Roman power. He had been granted Roman titles. But he also led a large military community looking for land, security, and a future. In 488, Zeno encouraged Theodoric to take Italy from Odoacer. It was an elegant plan from Constantinople's point of view. Send one dangerous Gothic army against another. If Theodoric won, Italy would be governed by a man who owed his position to the Eastern Emperor. If he failed, two problems might destroy each other. The war was brutal and lasted several years. Theodoric crossed the Alps with Goths, families, wagons, animals and soldiers. He won major battles, but Odoacer held on. The conflict moved through northern Italy, damaging cities and countryside already weakened by decades of uncertainty. Finally, in 493, after a long siege at Ravenna, the two leaders agreed to rule together. 10 days later, at a banquet meant to seal the settlement, Theodoric killed Odoacer with his own hands, according to later accounts. Then Theodoric became master of Italy. For more than 30 years, his kingdom achieved a stability that must have felt remarkable after the chaos of the 5th century. Theodoric called himself king, not emperor. He remained, at least formally, the subordinate of the Eastern Emperor. Coins continued to carry the emperor's image and name. But inside Italy, Theodoric ruled with considerable independence. His great problem was simple to describe and difficult to solve. How do you govern Romans and Goths together without making either side feel conquered? The Goths were a military people, perhaps numbering in the tens of thousands along with their families, settled among an Italian population of several million. Exact numbers are uncertain. What is clear is that the Goths were a minority. They could dominate through military organisation, but they could not replace Italy's farmers, craftsmen, merchants, clergy, senators, and administrators. So Theodoric preserved the Roman system wherever it served him. Roman officials managed civil administration. The Senate retained prestige. Latin remained the language of government. Men such as Cassiodorus wrote official letters in an elaborate Roman style, praising the king while presenting his rule as a restoration of order. Boethius, philosopher, aristocrat, and government official, served at Theodoric's court. Old offices, such as consul, continued, even if their power was now mostly ceremonial. The idea was almost comforting. The king would protect. The Roman population would continue its laws and civil life. The Goths would provide the army. Theodoric repaired aqueducts, walls, roads, and public buildings in several cities. Ravenna, his capital, received impressive new churches and a palace complex. Rome remained symbolically important. The Senate still mattered. The ancient city still received grain supplies, though on a more fragile scale than in its imperial peak. Officials still worried about the annona, the food distribution system that helped feed the urban population. A city cannot live on memories of greatness. It needs wheat, ships, warehouses, labour, and money. And that money was no longer as abundant or as reliable as it had been under the unified empire. If you're enjoying this slow journey through the strange survival of the Roman world, you can also find the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries on the website. The link is waiting in the description. For a while, Theodoric's Italy looked like proof that the Roman West could be rebuilt under new leadership. But the stability had limits. Goths and Romans were not simply two groups living happily side by side. The distinction was maintained in law, military service, religion, and politics. Most Goths followed Arian Christianity, while most Romans were Nicene Christians. the tradition that would later become Catholic Orthodoxy. Theodoric generally tolerated Nicene worship, and he even intervened to protect Jewish communities after violence in Rome. Yet religious difference remained a line of suspicion. So did loyalty to Constantinople. The Eastern Empire was Roman, Christian, wealthy, and close across the Adriatic. Roman senators could look eastward and imagine another source of authority. Theodoric could never be entirely certain whether Italy's old elite saw him as a legitimate king or a temporary guardian. By the 520s, his rule grew darker. Relations with Constantinople worsened. The Eastern Emperor Justin I took measures against Arian Christians. Theodoric feared that Roman aristocrats in Italy might be plotting with the East. Boethius was accused of treason, imprisoned and executed around 524. His father-in-law, the senator Symmachus, was executed soon afterward. We cannot know every detail behind the accusations. The sources are partisan and incomplete, but the message was unmistakable. Beneath the polished language of Roman restoration stood a king whose power ultimately rested on armed Gothic followers. When Theodoric died in 526, Italy had not ceased to be Roman. Its people had not vanished. Its senate, cities, churches, laws, farms and memories all endured. But the balance he had created was delicate. It depended on one unusually capable ruler, holding together old institutions, new military power, religious divisions, and the watchful presence of Constantinople. Once that ruler was gone, the tensions he had managed so carefully would begin to pull the kingdom apart. Across the Alps, the same question was being answered in a different way. What happens when Roman government fades, but Roman people remain? Gaul, the land that would one day become France, did not pass neatly from Roman rule to Frankish rule in a single year. It became a patchwork, a quilt stitched together from old provinces, armed communities, city governments, bishoprics, estates, and kingdoms, whose borders shifted whenever an army marched. In the south, the Visigoths ruled from their capital at Toulouse, holding much of Aquitaine and stretching into Hispania. In the southeast, the Burgundians controlled the Rhone valley and the cities around Lyon and Geneva. Along the Rhine, Alemanni and other frontier groups held territory that had once been guarded by Roman forts. In the northwest, Brittany remained connected to migrants from Britain and to its own local traditions. And in the north, around the old Roman province of Belgica, the Franks were gathering strength. The Franks were not one single people arriving all at once from some distant wilderness. They were a collection of groups from beyond and along the Rhine frontier, some of whom had served Rome for generations. Frankish soldiers had fought in Roman armies, Frankish leaders had received Roman titles. Frankish communities had settled inside imperial territory long before the Western Emperor disappeared. By the late 5th century, the difference between Roman and barbarian could be complicated. A man might speak Latin in court, use a Germanic name at home, serve under a Roman banner, and worship in a Christian church. Identity was not always a clean line, it was a set of overlapping loyalties. Then came Clovis. Clovis became king of one Frankish group, the Salian Franks, around 481 or 482. He was young, ambitious, and operating in a world where military success could transform a local ruler into a king of nations. To the south of his territory lay the domain of Syagrius, a Roman military leader based around Soissons. Later writers called this area the Kingdom of the Romans, though it was probably less a surviving Roman state than a regional military command holding together what it could. In 486, Clovis defeated Syagrius. This battle became a symbol. It did not mean that every Roman institution in northern Gaul suddenly vanished. It did not mean the population was replaced, but it meant that the strongest armed power in the region was now Frankish. Clovis took cities, tax revenues, estates, and perhaps most importantly, access to the existing machinery of local government. Because conquering Gaul was one thing, running it was another. The Frankish kings did not have enough newcomers to replace the millions of people already living there. Most of Gaul's population remained descended from the Gallo-Romans of the empire, farmers on old estates, tenants in villages, craftsmen in towns, merchants along rivers, landowners in country villas that were becoming fortified rural centres. They spoke forms of Latin. They used Roman measures and legal habits. They looked to bishops for protection, arbitration, and practical leadership. And the Franks needed them. This was why bishops became so powerful. In an empire, a city had once been tied into a vast hierarchy of governors, tax officials, military commanders, and imperial courts. As that structure weakened, the bishop was often the most permanent public figure left. He managed church property, organised charity, negotiated with kings, ransomed captives, settled disputes and preserved records. In many cities, the bishop was not simply a religious leader. He was the person people could actually find when something went wrong. Roman aristocrats remained important too. Their estates still produced grain, wine, livestock, and rents. Their education gave them access to law and administration. Some resisted Frankish rule, others served it. Over time, old Roman families and Frankish military elites intermarried, competed, donated land to churches and learned to speak the same political language. Clovis understood the value of that language. Around the turn of the 6th century, he converted to Nicene Christianity, probably after his marriage to the Burgundian princess Clotilde, who was already Nicene Christian. The exact timing and details are uncertain, and later church writers shaped the story into a dramatic conversion narrative. But the political meaning was clear. Most of Clovis's Roman subjects were Nicene Christians. So were the bishops whose support could make a conquest easier to govern. His main rivals, the Visigoths, were largely Arian Christians. By joining the Nicene Church, Clovis did not become Roman, but he made himself acceptable to many Romans. In 507, he defeated the Visigothic king Alaric II near Poitiers. Frankish authority spread into much of Aquitaine. The Burgundian kingdom was absorbed a generation later. Gradually, the patchwork became a Frankish realm. But Gaul did not become Frankish because everyone woke up speaking Frankish. Latin survived. In fact, it survived so thoroughly that it slowly changed into the early Romance speech from which French would eventually emerge. Frankish words entered that language, especially words connected with warfare, government, clothing, and rural life. Place names changed. Personal names changed. But the deep structure of everyday speech remained Latin because most people were still the descendants of Roman Gauls. Law changed in a similarly layered way. Frankish kings issued law codes, including the Salic law, with its fines, kinship rules, and assumptions about a warrior society. Yet Roman law continued for many Roman subjects. In practice, people could be judged according to different legal traditions depending on who they were, where they lived, and which court had authority. It was not one legal system replacing another. It was several systems learning, awkwardly, to share the same landscape. Military service changed too. The old Roman state had relied on taxes to support professional armies. Frankish kings relied more heavily on personal loyalty, armed followers attached to kings and nobles, rewarded with gifts, offices, and eventually rights to land and revenue. Landholding became more closely tied to service and protection. And this is how Gaul became Frankish, not through the disappearance of Romans, but through the creation of a new ruling order above a largely Roman population. Frankish kings, Roman bishops, old aristocrats, local farmers, and soldiers from many backgrounds slowly became part of the same kingdom. The name changed first, the people changed more slowly. And beneath the new Frankish crown, much of Roman Gaul continued to live on. Across the Pyrenees, the story was slower still. Hispania, the Roman peninsula that would one day become Spain and Portugal, had been part of the empire for centuries. It had cities with forums and baths, vineyards and olive groves, mines, roads, estates, bishops, courts, tax collectors, and a population that mostly spoke Latin in one form or another. It was not untouched by the crises of the 5th century, but neither was it simply overrun and emptied. The first great shock came in 409. A coalition of Suebi, Vandals and Alans crossed the Pyrenees from Gaul into Hispania. The exact details are difficult to reconstruct. Our sources are limited, often written later, and usually interested in kings and battles rather than frightened families in farming villages. But it is clear that armed groups entered a province already weakened by civil war, military withdrawals, and struggles for control at the highest levels of the Roman state. The newcomers did not arrive as one united army. The Suebi, Vandals and Alans were different peoples with different leaders, and they competed for land, food, tribute and authority. By 411, according to a later account, they had divided parts of the peninsula among themselves. The Suebi settled in the northwest, in the region of Galaecia, roughly modern Galicia and northern Portugal. The Alans took territories in the west and south. The Vandals occupied areas of the south and east. On paper, it may look like a clean division of provinces. On the ground, it probably felt much messier. A Roman landowner might still be collecting rents from tenants. A bishop might still be holding services in a city church. A village might still be planting wheat, tending sheep, pressing olives, and hoping that no army passed too close. But now the officials who claimed authority could change from one year to the next. Taxes might be demanded by a Roman commander, a local strongman, or a new king with foreign-speaking warriors at his side. And then the Visigoths arrived. The Visigoths had already spent decades inside the Roman world. They had fought Roman armies, served Roman emperors, settled in Roman provinces, and learned how useful Roman administration could be. In 418 they were established in southwestern Gaul as imperial allies, or federates. From there they became one of the strongest military powers in the Western Empire. Rome used them. As Rome had used so many frontier armies before, to deal with threats it could no longer handle easily itself. Visigothic forces entered Hispania repeatedly during the 5th century, fighting Vandals, Alans and other rivals in the name of Roman order. The result was not a restoration of the old empire. It was the slow growth of Visigothic power. The Alans were defeated. Many Vandals eventually crossed into North Africa in 429, where they would create a powerful kingdom of their own. The Suebi remained in the northwest for more than a century. And across much of the peninsula, Roman provincial life continued under increasingly local and uncertain conditions. This is important. When we say that barbarian kingdoms took over Hispania, it can sound as if huge new populations replaced everyone already there. But the number of incoming warriors and their families was probably small compared with the existing population. The overwhelming majority of people were still Hispano-Romans, farmers, labourers, artisans, clergy, merchants and landowners whose families had lived under Roman rule for generations. They did not vanish, they adjusted. Some cities declined. Public buildings were no longer repaired as before. Forums lost their old purpose. Urban councils had less money and less power. Long-distance trade became less reliable in some regions. Roads remained, but the state that had maintained them was weaker. Yet cities endured. They endured because people still needed markets, churches, workshops, storage, law courts, and places where local authority could gather. In many towns, the bishop became the most visible heir to Roman civic life. The old city might no longer have a powerful imperial governor, but it could still have a cathedral, clergy, church lands, charitable institutions, and records preserved by educated men trained in Latin. The Visigothic kings needed these people. A king could win a battle with a relatively small war band, but he could not govern an entire peninsula without tax collectors, scribes, judges, bishops, and local landowners who knew the country. So the Visigothic kingdom gradually adopted Roman habits of rule. It used Roman cities as centres of power. It issued laws in Latin. It relied on written administration. It collected revenue where it could. It worked with bishops. And it ruled a population that remained in language and daily custom deeply Roman. But there was a problem at the heart of this arrangement. Most Hispano-Romans were Nicene Christians, loyal to the form of Christianity accepted by the Roman Church. Many Visigothic rulers and elites were Arian Christians, following a theology that most Roman bishops considered heretical. They worshipped the same God and read the same scriptures, but they disagreed over the nature of Christ. That disagreement could become a political boundary between ruler and ruled. For generations the kingdom contained both communities. Sometimes the divide was sharp, sometimes it was softened by practical cooperation, intermarriage, and the simple fact that neighbours still had to live beside one another. But it remained a source of tension until 589, when King Record publicly converted to Nicene Christianity. That conversion mattered enormously. It did not instantly create unity. Nothing in this period happened instantly, but it allowed Visigothic kings and Hispano-Roman bishops to speak the same religious language. Church councils, especially those held at Toledo, became central political gatherings. Bishops and nobles debated doctrine, succession, law, royal authority, and public order. The church was not separate from government in the modern sense. It was one of the main places where government happened. By the 7th century, Visigothic rulers were also trying to create a more integrated legal order. Earlier laws had often distinguished between Goths and Romans. Later, legal collections moved toward rules intended for the kingdom as a whole. The process was imperfect, and law on parchment was not always law in a distant village. Still, it shows what the kings wanted. Not two peoples living beside each other forever, but one Christian kingdom ruled through a shared political tradition. Meanwhile, beyond Toledo and the royal court, life remained local. In the northwestern hills, old Subic lands retained their own character. In mountain regions and borderlands, royal power could be thin. Along the coasts, trade connected some communities to the Mediterranean world, while inland settlements depended mostly on nearby fields, flocks, rivers, and seasonal markets. There were raids, rebellions, famines, and struggles between noble families. There were also years when the harvest came in, children grew up, marriages were arranged, and villages carried on much as villages always had. Hispania did not become Visigothic in one conquest. It became Visigothic over generations, as Roman institutions were reduced, reused, and reshaped. The empire's flag disappeared, its taxes became less regular. Its armies no longer came from a distant emperor, but its language, laws, cities, churches, and agricultural communities remained woven into the new kingdom. And while the Visigoths were building this long afterlife of Rome in the west, another Roman province across the sea was facing a far more sudden rupture. North Africa had once been one of the richest regions in the Western Empire. Soon it would become the prize everyone wanted. North Africa had once been one of the richest regions in the Western Empire. Not rich in the vague ceremonial sense, rich in the practical sense that mattered most to an ancient state. It produced grain, olive oil, wine, livestock, pottery, and tax revenue. Its fields helped feed cities far beyond Africa itself. Above all, they helped feed Rome. For centuries, grain ships had crossed from African ports to Italy. The city of Rome, with its enormous population and its politically important grain distributions, depended on supplies carried over the Mediterranean. If those shipments failed, the consequences were immediate. Bread became expensive, crowds became anxious, emperors became vulnerable. Africa was also a major source of cash. Its prosperous estates, commercial towns, ports and workshops were deeply tied into Roman taxation. Revenue from Africa paid soldiers, supported officials, and helped sustain the increasingly strained machinery of the Western state. By the early 5th century, when imperial control over Gaul, Britain, and much of Hispania was becoming uncertain, Africa was not a peripheral province. It was one of the last great pillars still holding the Western Empire up, and that made it a prize. In 429, the Vandals crossed from southern Hispania into North Africa. Ancient writers say that perhaps tens of thousands came with them, including warriors, women, children, servants, and dependents. The exact number is impossible to know. Ancient figures are often exaggerated, and a migrating army was not a census-taking operation. But whatever their number, the Vandals were not simply a small raiding party. They were a people on the move, led first by King Gunderic, and then by his far more famous successor, Gaiseric. They had spent years in Hispania, fighting Roman forces, competing with other groups, and trying to secure land and survival. Now they crossed the narrow stretch of sea toward a province that was richer, more urbanized, and more valuable than anything they had held before. Why they crossed remains partly uncertain. One later tradition claimed that a Roman commander in Africa, Bonifacius, invited them during a political struggle with the imperial court. Other historians doubt that story, or think it was shaped by later attempts to explain a disaster. What is clear is that Roman Africa was divided by internal conflict when the Vandals arrived, and a divided province was much easier to conquer. The Vandal advance was destructive. Cities were threatened, estates were seized, refugees fled, Roman armies tried to resist, sometimes with help from Eastern emperors in Constantinople, but they could not remove the new arrivals. Then, in 439, Gaiseric captured Carthage. That was the turning point. Carthage was no ordinary city. It was one of the largest and most important cities in the Roman West, a centre of administration, trade, craftsmanship, learning and church life. It had harbours, warehouses, baths, churches, markets, and dense neighbourhoods full of people whose lives had been shaped by Roman rule for generations. When Carthage fell, the Western Empire lost far more than a city. It lost access to a huge share of Africa's wealth. The grain fleets that had supplied Italy could now be controlled, redirected, or withheld by a Vandal king. The tax revenues that had sustained Western armies were no longer reliably available. From their new capital, the Vandals also built a fleet powerful enough to raid the Mediterranean and bargain with emperors as equals. The conquest helped make the fall of the Western Empire much harder to reverse. But conquest did not mean that African life stopped. This is one of the important patterns of the lost century after Rome fell. Political control could change with shocking speed. Everyday life changed more unevenly. Carthage remained a major city. Its streets were still inhabited, its harbour still functioned. Trade continued across the Mediterranean. Archaeologists have found evidence that African workshops kept producing pottery in large quantities, much of it exported overseas. African red slipware, the distinctive fine table pottery made in the region, continued to travel widely. Farms continued as well. Olives still had to be harvested. Grain still had to be planted. Presses still turned olives into oil. Labourers, tenants, estate managers and landowners still had to negotiate rents, store food, repair tools and survive bad weather. Some estates changed hands. Some suffered, some communities may have been displaced. But the countryside was not simply emptied by the Vandals. In some regions, production remained remarkably strong. The new rulers needed that prosperity. A kingdom cannot live on military victories alone. Gaiseric and his successors needed grain, taxes, ports, ships, craftsmen, and the cooperation, willing or reluctant, of the much larger Roman African population. So they used what Rome had built. They governed from Carthage. They employed Roman administrative practices. They minted coins. They drew wealth from estates and cities. Their elite may have been culturally distinct, but their kingdom rested on a deeply Roman economic landscape. Religion, however, created a sharper boundary. Most Roman Africans were Nicene Christians, connected to the theological tradition supported by the Roman Church and the emperors in Constantinople. The Vandal ruling elite was largely Arian Christian. This was not a conflict between Christians and non-Christians. Both sides read the Bible, worshipped Christ, and had bishops, clergy, churches, and theological arguments of astonishing intensity. But they disagreed about the nature of Christ, and in this world such disagreement was also a question of power. Some Vandal kings tolerated Nicene communities to a degree. Others confiscated churches, expelled bishops, restricted worship, or favoured Arian clergy. The severity varied from reign to reign. Under King Huneric in the 480s, Nicene clergy faced particularly harsh persecution. Other periods were less severe, though the imbalance of power remained. For ordinary people, this could mean that the church nearest their home changed hands, that a bishop disappeared into exile, or that a family had to navigate the demands of rulers who did not share their religious identity. Still, African Christianity endured. Bishops continued writing. Monasteries continued. Congregations continued gathering when they could. The intellectual traditions of Roman Africa, shaped earlier by figures such as Augustine of Hippo, did not vanish with the imperial government. Then, a century after the Vandals had taken Carthage, another empire came across the sea. In 533, the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian sent an army under the general Belisarius to recover Africa. The Vandal kingdom, weakened by internal tensions and diplomatic isolation, collapsed with startling speed. Carthage returned to imperial control. On paper, Rome had come back. But restoration was not the same as recovery. The Byzantine reconquest brought battles, new officials, new taxes, confiscations, and demands on communities already accustomed to Vandal rule. Some Nicene Christians welcomed the end of Arian royal power. Others simply faced another transfer of authority, another army needing food, another set of men claiming the right to collect revenue. And warfare did not end neatly with the first victory. Resistance, rebellion, and conflict on the frontiers continued for years. North Africa had been too valuable to escape the struggles of great powers. First it had fed the Western Empire. Then it had sustained a Vandal kingdom. Then it became a recovered province of the Eastern Roman Empire. Through each transition, millions of people remained where they had always been, in towns, on farms, beside churches, near harbours, trying to preserve ordinary life beneath rulers who changed far more often than the seasons. Across the sea, in Britain, the Roman world would break apart in a different way. There no rich grain fleets were waiting to be captured. There was only an island at the edge of the old empire, and a silence that would grow deeper with every passing generation. Britain had always been different. It was Roman, certainly. For nearly 4 centuries, Britain had governors, tax collectors, forts, paved roads, baths, towns, villas, markets, temples, churches, and garrisons stationed along its frontiers. Its elites spoke Latin. Its coins carried imperial faces. Its soldiers served in armies from the Rhine to the Danube. But Britain was also an island, Far from the Mediterranean heart of Roman wealth, it depended heavily on imperial connections. Soldiers paid in coin, officials sent from overseas, supplies moving through ports, and military commands capable of organising defence. When those connections weakened, Britain felt the strain early. By the beginning of the 5th century, Roman rule was already becoming uncertain. In 407, troops in Britain proclaimed a new emperor, Constantine III, and carried him across the Channel into Gaul. They were not simply abandoning their homes for adventure. The Western Empire was in crisis. Armies were competing for control. Groups had crossed the Rhine frontier. Provinces were threatened. A commander with soldiers was often more important than a distant emperor with promises. But when Constantine and many of his troops left Britain, they did not return. The island still had local communities, local leaders, and perhaps some remaining soldiers. But the old imperial structure was thinning out. Tax collection became harder. Coinage became scarce. The official machinery that repaired roads, provisioned forts, and coordinated large-scale defence was no longer reliable. A famous account, written much later, says that in 410 the Emperor Honorius told the cities of Britain to look to their own defence. Historians still debate exactly what this message meant, and even whether the surviving text has been correctly understood. But the larger reality is clear enough. By the early 5th century, Britain was no longer being governed as a functioning province of the Roman Empire. There was no single dramatic day when every official packed a bag, every fort went dark, and every Roman suddenly became something else. Instead, authority became local. In some places, town councils may have struggled on for a while. In others, powerful landowners, military leaders, bishops, or community elders took on responsibilities once handled by imperial officials. People still farmed, they still raised animals, repaired houses, buried their dead, married, argued over land, and worried about winter. But the systems that had connected these ordinary lives to a vast empire were breaking apart. The archaeology of Britain shows this rupture with unusual clarity. Many Roman towns declined sharply during the 5th century. Public baths stopped being maintained. Forums and civic buildings fell into disuse. Town houses were divided, adapted, or abandoned. Streets that had once carried carts, traders, soldiers, and officials were no longer repaired with the old regularity. In some places, people continued living among Roman walls and stone buildings. But they used them differently. A grand room might become a workshop. A bath complex might become a rubbish dump. Materials from old buildings could be stripped away and reused elsewhere. Roof tiles, dressed stone, bricks, and metal fittings became valuable resources in a world where large organised construction was becoming rarer. This does not mean that everyone vanished. Britain was not an empty island waiting for new settlers to arrive. Most people remained where they had always lived, in rural communities. They worked fields that had been cultivated before the Roman conquest, and would continue to be cultivated long afterward. They lived in houses that often left little trace in the ground. Their world may have become less connected to towns, coins, and imported goods, but it did not cease to exist. Still, the rhythm of trade changed. Roman Britain had imported pottery, wine, olive oil, glassware, and other goods from across the Channel and the Mediterranean. By the 5th century, much of this long-distance commerce had faded. Coins became increasingly rare after the early decades of the century. For ordinary people that mattered, coin was not just money. It was a sign that taxes, soldiers, markets, and state payments still linked distant regions together. When the coin stopped arriving, people did not forget how to trade. They exchanged goods locally. They used credit, obligations, favours, livestock, grain, and labour. But the old imperial economy, with its regular supply chains and standardized money, no longer shaped daily life in the same way. Then came migration. Germanic-speaking groups from continental Europe had probably appeared in Britain before Roman administration ended. Some may have been recruited as soldiers. Roman authorities had long employed troops from beyond the frontier, and Britain had faced raids from Saxons and other seaborne groups for generations. But during the 5th century, the scale and consequences of migration grew. Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and other groups crossed the North Sea and the Channel. Some came as warriors hired by British leaders. Some came with families. Some may have arrived in relatively small groups, settling near existing communities. Others came in the context of fighting, land seizure, and political collapse. The evidence does not support a simple story of every Briton being driven away or killed, but neither was this merely a peaceful change of fashion. Cemeteries, settlements, language, and later written sources all suggest that new populations established themselves, especially in eastern and southern Britain. Over time, new kingdoms emerged: Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. Their rulers spoke languages that would develop into Old English. Their political world looked increasingly toward the North Sea rather than toward Rome. Meanwhile, Brittonic-speaking communities survived in the west, in Wales, Cornwall, and parts of the north. Others crossed the sea to Armorica, the region of Gaul that would eventually be known as Brittany. And somewhere inside this troubled century lies the shadow of Arthur. Later medieval writers told of a great British war leader who resisted the Saxons, won battles, and held back the collapse of Roman Britain. It is a powerful story. It gave later generations a king, a court, a sword, a final shining defence of an older world. But the evidence is uncertain. No contemporary source clearly identifies King Arthur as the figure of legend. A British leader may have existed, several leaders may have been blended together, or Arthur may be a later creation built from fragments of real conflict, memory, and hope. What we can say is simpler, and perhaps sadder. Britain did resist. Communities fought, some rulers held territory, some regions remained outside the new Anglo-Saxon kingdoms for centuries. But the island's Roman order did not survive in the way that Roman tradition survived in Italy, Gaul, or Hispania. Elsewhere in the West, new kings often ruled through Roman cities, Roman taxes, Roman laws, and Roman bishops. In Britain, towns contracted more deeply, coinage disappeared sooner, trade narrowed, and Latin public life became far more fragile. Rome had not vanished from memory. Its roads remained. Its walls remained. Its ruins stood over fields and villages like the bones of something enormous. But for many communities in Britain, the empire was no longer an institution shaping the present. It was becoming a distant past, and as the old structures faded, another institution would begin gathering what could still be remembered, and as the old structures faded, another institution would begin gathering what could still be remembered. The Church did not replace the Roman Empire overnight. It was not a perfectly organized rescue system, waiting in the wings with a plan for the collapse. Churches themselves depended on the Roman world. Bishops used Roman roads, Roman cities, Roman law, Roman literacy, and Roman habits of administration. When those systems weakened, the Church suffered too. But it endured in places where other institutions became unreliable. In a Roman city, the bishop had once been only one important figure among many. There were governors, magistrates, tax officials, military commanders, wealthy civic patrons, and town councils. The bishop led religious life. He oversaw clergy, church property, worship, charity, and disputes among believers. Then, slowly, many of the other offices lost their power. Governors were no longer regularly appointed. Town councils had fewer resources. Imperial tax systems became patchy or disappeared. Armies moved according to the needs of kings and warlords rather than the commands of distant emperors. And in that uncertain space, bishops often became the most visible public leaders left. They could write letters. They could negotiate with kings. They managed land and donations. They knew local families. They had contacts in other cities. In an emergency, a bishop might organise food relief, ransom captives, repair a church building, settle a legal argument, or speak for the population when armed men arrived at the gates. This did not make every bishop a saint, or every church a refuge from politics. Bishops could be ambitious. They came from elite families. Some competed fiercely for office. Some supported one ruler against another. Some were deeply involved in the local power struggles of the post-Roman world. But that is exactly why they mattered. They were not outside society. They were becoming part of the machinery that kept society functioning. In Gaul, Italy, Hispania, and North Africa, bishops increasingly acted as mediators between ordinary communities and new rulers. A Gothic, Frankish, Vandal, or Burgundian king might command warriors, but a bishop often understood the city, its landowners, its poor, its customs, its records, and its fears. For people living through the transition, that practical role may have mattered more than great theological arguments. If your harvest failed, a church might distribute grain. If your family had been captured in a raid, a bishop or religious community might help collect ransom. If you were poor, sick, widowed, orphaned, or displaced, church charities could provide a thin but real layer of support. Not enough to end suffering, never enough to protect everyone, but sometimes enough to make survival possible. Churches also gave communities places to gather when older civic spaces were changing. The forum, bathhouse, or council chamber had belonged to the Roman city. The church belonged to a different kind of public life. People came there for worship, certainly, but also for announcements, disputes, alms, funerals, agreements, and the rituals that marked birth, marriage, death, and memory. And then there were the monasteries. The monasteries of the early medieval West were not yet all the grand stone institutions people imagine from later centuries. Some were small communities of men or women living under religious discipline. Some were attached to churches or founded on estates. Some were remote, others stood close to towns and royal centres. Their importance varied enormously from place to place. But monasteries could create stability. They organised labour. They cultivated land. They offered hospitality to travellers. They cared for the poor in ways their resources allowed. And because prayer and reading were central to their purpose, they became places where literacy could survive even when the old educational world was shrinking. This is where the image of monks saving every book from antiquity needs a little caution. Many classical texts were lost. Many books were never copied. Libraries disappeared in war, neglect, fire, and poverty. The Church did not preserve everything. Sometimes Christian writers rejected pagan learning. Sometimes there simply was not enough parchment, money, or skilled labour to maintain large collections. But religious communities preserved a great deal. They copied the Bible, sermons, letters, saints' lives, legal texts, chronicles, and works of grammar. In copying what they needed to understand Latin, they also preserved parts of the Roman literary inheritance. Cicero, Virgil, Ovid, Livy, and many others survived unevenly, in fragments, selections, or manuscripts made centuries after the empire fell. Roman law survived too, although not unchanged. New kings issued their own laws, but they often ruled populations who still used Roman legal ideas. Written documents, wills, property claims, contracts, and court procedures continued in many regions. The old empire was no longer one political body, yet its habits remained useful, and perhaps that was the Church's deepest role. It offered a new identity that could stretch across broken borders. A person might be Roman by language, Gothic by ancestry, Frankish by political loyalty, African by homeland, or British by memory. But they could also be Christian. This did not erase older identities. It added another layer. The Church was not one united force. It was divided by language, local custom, theology, and political allegiance. Catholic bishops and Arian kings sometimes distrusted one another. Churches in different kingdoms followed different leaders. North Africa, Italy, Gaul, Hispania, and Britain each had their own struggles. Still, across the ruins of imperial administration, the Church carried prayers, books, laws, names, and stories from one generation to the next. Rome was becoming the past. But in churches, monasteries, and the minds of people who could still read its language, parts of that past remained alive. But memory could not stop a hungry army. A bishop could negotiate. A monastery could share grain. A church could ransom a few captives. None of that made the 6th century peaceful. For millions of people, the end of Roman rule was not experienced as a date in a history book. It was experienced as uncertainty. Would the soldiers pass through this year? Would they take food, animals, tools, or sons? Would the tax collector arrive before the harvest? Would the roads still be safe enough to bring grain from the coast? Would the walls hold if another army appeared beyond the fields? War in late antiquity did not always look like the giant clashes of later legend. There were battles, of course. Armies fought over Italy, Gaul, Hispania, Africa, and the Balkans. Kings invaded. Emperors tried to reconquer lost provinces. Rival generals fought civil wars. Cities were besieged, captured, and sometimes looted. But the deeper damage often happened away from the battlefield. An army needed food every day. It needed horses, carts, fodder, iron, leather, and labour. Wherever soldiers marched, local people could be ordered to provide supplies. If they refused or could not provide enough, supplies might simply be taken. Picture a farming family in central Italy. Their village has heard that troops are moving nearby. Nobody knows whether they are imperial soldiers, Gothic soldiers, or men serving whichever commander has promised them pay and plunder. The family has grain stored for winter. They have a few animals. They have seed grain needed for next spring. If soldiers take the grain, the problem is not only tonight's meal, it is next year's crop. If they take the ox, there may be no ploughing. If they burn the barn, the family may abandon the land. If the men are forced into military service, captured for ransom or killed in a raid, the people left behind must somehow keep the household alive. This is how political collapse became personal. It was not necessary for every town to be destroyed, or every field to be abandoned, for communities to suffer terribly. A single missed harvest could push a household into debt. 2 bad years could force a family to sell land. A siege could trap people inside a city, while food prices climbed beyond reach. A raid could scatter a village so thoroughly that survivors spent years living with relatives, seeking protection from a landlord or moving toward a fortified town. We have accounts of these events, but they are uneven. Chroniclers tended to write about kings, bishops, sieges, and miracles. Archaeology can reveal burned buildings, abandoned settlements, coins vanishing from circulation, or changes in burial patterns. But it rarely tells us exactly what one family felt as it packed up its possessions and left. So we should be careful. The old story says Rome fell, and the entire Western population vanished into darkness. That is not what the evidence shows. Many regions continued farming. Many towns endured, Many people stayed where their parents and grandparents had lived. Yet survival did not mean comfort. A community could endure while becoming poorer, smaller, less connected, and more vulnerable to the next shock. And then there was disease. Late antiquity had always known epidemic illness. The Roman Mediterranean was densely connected by ships, roads, armies, markets and migration. Those connections brought wealth, but they also carried infections. Sources mention outbreaks in various periods, though ancient writers rarely describe symptoms with enough precision for modern diagnosis. A pestilence could mean many things: plague, smallpox, measles, dysentery, malaria, famine-related disease, or an illness we can no longer identify. The most famous outbreak came in the middle of the 6th century. In 541, a devastating epidemic appeared in the eastern Mediterranean, reaching Constantinople and then spreading through parts of the Roman world. Modern researchers usually identify it as bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Genetic evidence from some early medieval burials supports the presence of that disease in Europe. Contemporary writers described frightening mortality, overwhelmed burial systems, and a city where the ordinary rhythms of life seemed to stop. This was what we now call the Justinianic Plague, named for Emperor Justinian, whose reign was already marked by expensive wars and ambitious attempts to restore Roman power in the West. The plague did not remain confined to one city or one year. It returned in waves over the following 2 centuries. In some places, especially major ports, cities and regions, already damaged by war or food shortages, the effects may have been catastrophic. Imagine the pressure building all at once. Fields disrupted by conflict, taxes demanded by rulers at war, trade routes becoming unreliable. Then disease enters a town. Workers die, farmers die, sailors die, priests, merchants, children and soldiers die. Those who survive may face empty workshops, uncultivated land, labour shortages, and families broken apart. It is easy to understand why later generations remembered this period as a time when the world itself seemed to be failing. But again, the scale remains debated. Some historians have argued that the Justinianic plague killed an enormous share of the Mediterranean population and permanently transformed the economy. Others point out that our written sources are concentrated in certain places and often use dramatic language. Archaeological evidence does not show the same sudden collapse everywhere. The impact was probably severe, but uneven, worse in some regions, lighter in others, devastating in particular years, and less visible in others. There was no single universal experience of disaster. A family in a besieged Italian city, a farmer in a contested Balkan valley, a merchant in plague-stricken Constantinople, and a village household in a relatively stable part of Gaul did not live through the same fall of Rome. They inhabited different worlds, connected by old Roman networks, but exposed to different dangers. And that is the human cost hidden beneath the big story. Not simply millions disappearing, not a whole civilization extinguished overnight, but countless difficult decisions made with too little information and too few good choices. Stay and hope the army passes by, leave, and risk the road. Hide the grain, send a child to relatives, pay ransom. Seek shelter near a church, accept the protection of a new lord. Keep planting, even when you cannot be sure anyone will be alive to harvest. The Roman Empire had once promised, however imperfectly, that order came from above. In the centuries after its Western government fell, ordinary people learned that order had to be rebuilt closer to home. One household, one village, one fragile season at a time. And this brings us back to the question behind the silence. Where did the Romans go? The simple answer is that most of them did not go anywhere. They stayed. They stayed in the villages where their families had farmed for generations. They stayed in the old cities even when those cities became smaller, poorer, and enclosed behind repaired walls. They stayed in river valleys, on hillsides, beside ancient roads, near shrines that became churches, and in houses built from the stones of older Roman buildings. The Western Empire disappeared as a political system. Its tax offices weakened, its armies fragmented, its emperors vanished from Italy. But the people called Romans did not suddenly vanish with them. A farmer in Gaul did not wake up in 476 and become a different person. A potter in Hispania did not forget his parents, his language, or the road leading to the nearest market, because an emperor had been removed in Ravenna. A family in North Africa did not cease to exist because Vandals ruled Carthage. For most people, the first changes were practical, not dramatic. Different officials, different soldiers, new rulers on coins when coins still arrived, new demands for food, labour, taxes, or loyalty, and slowly, over generations, new names. That is the important part. Identities changed. In the Roman Empire, Roman could mean many things. It could mean a citizen. It could mean someone who lived under Roman law. It could mean a person who spoke Latin, paid imperial taxes, served in an imperial army, worshipped in a Roman church, or simply belonged to the political world of Rome. After the empire's Western government broke apart, those meanings began to separate. A man living in Gaul might still speak a form of Latin, attend a Catholic church, use Roman legal customs, and call himself Roman. But he might now owe obedience to a Frankish king. His children might serve in a Frankish army. His grandchildren might begin thinking of themselves as people of a place, a city, a region, or a kingdom rather than citizens of one vast Mediterranean empire. Nobody had to disappear for that transformation to happen. They only had to live long enough for the old labels to become less useful. This is one reason the evidence can seem confusing. Written sources often describe Franks, Goths, Burgundians, Lombards, Vandals, Romans, and Provincials as though each were a separate, clearly defined people. Sometimes they were separate communities with different laws, military traditions, languages, and memories. But real life was messier. People married across boundaries. Soldiers changed employers. Local elites learned the customs of new courts. Newcomers settled among older populations. Children grew up speaking more than one language, or speaking a local Latin that gradually absorbed new words and accents. By the early Middle Ages, a family could have ancestors who had called themselves Roman, Gothic, and Frankish, while their descendants simply considered themselves Christian people of a particular town or countryside. Graves can offer clues. Burial customs sometimes changed, with new jewellery styles, weapons, buckles, clothing fasteners, or ways of arranging the dead. But a buckle does not tell us exactly what language its owner spoke, or what identity they felt in their heart. A person might be buried with a Frankish-style weapon and still have local Roman grandparents. A woman might wear Gothic jewellery because it was fashionable, valuable, or connected to marriage, not because she belonged to a fixed Gothic race, material culture, shows contact and change. It does not always reveal a clean line between peoples. Genetics can help too, but it must be handled carefully. Ancient DNA has shown that late Roman and early medieval Europe was more mobile than older stories sometimes imagined. Soldiers, migrants, enslaved people, traders and families moved across long distances. Some regions received substantial new populations. Others show much more continuity with the people who had lived there before. But genetics cannot tell us who felt Roman on a particular morning. It cannot directly reveal language, law, religion, or loyalty. A population can change its language without being replaced. It can adopt a new kingdom's identity while remaining descended largely from the people already living there. And that, in many places, is what happened, Latin did not die in the western provinces. It changed. The Latin spoken by officials, poets, lawyers and schoolmasters had always been different from the fast, flexible Latin spoken in kitchens, markets, barracks, workshops and fields. Once the empire's schools, administration and long-distance communications became weaker, local speech changed more quickly. Pronunciations shifted, grammar simplified in some ways and developed new patterns in others. Local words entered everyday speech. Over centuries, these spoken Latin dialects became the Romance languages. In Italy, they became the ancestors of Italian and its many regional forms. In Gaul, they developed into French, Occitan, and other languages. In Hispania, they became Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, and related tongues. In parts of the Balkans, they contributed to Romanian and its relatives. So when people ask where the Romans went, one answer is hidden in the languages still spoken today. They became the people who said aqua instead of aqua, o instead of aqua, agua instead of aqua. The word changed. The descendants remained. Place names preserve another layer of memory. Across Western Europe, ancient city names continued long after imperial rule ended. Paris kept the memory of an older Gallic people, but remained a Roman and then Frankish city. Lyon grew from Lugdunum. London preserved traces of Londinium. In Italy, roads, bridges, town walls, aqueducts, and ruined villas remained part of the landscape, even when people no longer knew exactly who had built them. Documents reveal continuity too. Charters, legal formulas, church records and letters show Roman landowners, Roman clergy, Roman customs and Roman ideas surviving under new kings. In some places, Roman law remained important for centuries. In others, it blended with Frankish, Gothic or Lombard traditions. The old empire was gone, but its habits remained embedded in ordinary life. The Church helped hold many of those habits together. A bishop in 6th century Gaul might write Latin, quote Roman authors, use Roman legal language, and negotiate with a Frankish ruler. A Spanish cleric might preserve texts copied in a Roman tradition while serving a Visigothic kingdom. An Italian monastery might maintain ancient learning in a world where the imperial bureaucracy that once supported education had faded. Christian identity also became more important than many older political identities. To be Catholic, Arian, Orthodox, or later simply Christian could matter as much as, or more than, being Roman, Goth, or Frank. That did not erase conflict. Religious divisions could be bitter. But it created new communities that crossed old imperial borders. So the lost century after Rome was not empty. It was crowded with survivors, with farmers adapting to new taxes, with city dwellers repairing old walls, with bishops preserving records, with kings borrowing Roman titles, with children learning altered versions of Latin, with migrants arriving, local families remaining, and both groups becoming something neither had been before. The Romans did not vanish into darkness. They became medieval Italians, French, Spaniards, Portuguese, Romanians, and many other peoples whose identities would have sounded strange to their ancestors. They became citizens of kingdoms rather than an empire, speakers of new languages rather than imperial Latin, members of local churches, towns, regions, and lordships. Rome fell as a system of rule, humanity continued, and that may be the gentlest way to understand the end of the Roman West. Not as a moment when millions of people vanished, not as a curtain falling followed by silence, but as a long adjustment to a world in which the old centre no longer held. The empire had been an enormous machine. It collected taxes from distant provinces. It paid soldiers, it supplied cities, it maintained roads, ports, offices, archives, and laws. It moved grain across the sea and messages across mountains. For centuries, it gave people from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the Balkans, a shared political horizon. Then, in the West, that machine broke into pieces. Some parts failed quickly, others kept working in smaller forms. A city council might disappear, while the market continued. An imperial tax collector might be gone, while a local landowner still gathered rents. A military garrison might leave, while a bishop remained. A road might no longer be repaired by the state, but people still walked it, led animals along it, and carried news from one settlement to another. The end of imperial government was real. It mattered deeply. It changed the lives of millions, but it was not the end of life. For a family living in a village, history may have arrived in fragments. First, a rumour that troops had marched through a nearby town. Then a new demand for grain. Then fewer coins in circulation. Then a road becoming rougher each year. Then a local church taking on roles once handled by officials. Then children growing up under a king whose name their grandparents had never heard. Nobody standing in a field could see the whole shape of the transformation. They could see only the next harvest, the next winter, the next tax demand, the next uncertainty. And this is why the centuries after Rome feel so difficult to grasp. The evidence is uneven because survival was uneven. In some regions, old Roman cities remained important. In others, they shrank dramatically. In parts of Gaul and Hispania, Roman laws, Latin writing, bishops and elite families continued under new rulers. In Italy, the old imperial heartland endured repeated wars and political changes, yet retained an unusually dense inheritance of Roman institutions and memories. North Africa, once one of the wealthiest regions of the Western Empire, continued to produce food, trade goods, and learned Christian writing under Vandal rule. But later wars between the Eastern Roman Empire and its rivals brought destruction that many communities struggled to recover from. Britain saw a sharper break with the Roman world than many continental provinces. Town life weakened, coin use declined, long-distance trade changed. Yet people remained there too. They farmed, built, fought, prayed, married, mourned, and created new kingdoms from the pieces of an older world. There was no single experience called the Fall of Rome. There were thousands of local experiences. A prosperous estate might survive while a nearby village was abandoned. One coastal town might remain linked to Mediterranean trade, while another became quieter and more isolated. A generation might know war and hunger. Their children might inherit greater stability. Or the opposite might happen. A place that seemed secure for decades could be overturned by invasion, plague, failed harvests, or civil war. The story does not move neatly from Rome to ruin, then from ruin to recovery. It moves in waves: continuity, loss, adaptation, renewal, and then loss again. That is the pattern we find when we look closely enough. It can be tempting to want a cleaner answer, to ask exactly how many people died, exactly how many migrants arrived, exactly when a town ceased to be Roman, exactly when a family began to think of itself as Frankish, Gothic, Lombard, British, or something else. Sometimes the evidence lets us answer. More often it leaves us with possibilities. A ruined building can tell us it was abandoned, but not always why. A coin can tell us that trade reached a place, but not who carried it. A cemetery can reveal changing customs, but not the private thoughts of those buried there. A chronicle may describe a king, a battle, or a famine, but it rarely tells us what an ordinary child remembered about the year it happened. Historical uncertainty is not a failure of the story. It is part of the story. The past is not a perfectly preserved record waiting for us to read. It is a landscape of fragments: broken pottery, faded letters, graves, laws copied by monks, ruined walls, names written once and never again. From those fragments we can see enough to reject the oldest, darkest myth. Rome did not fall and leave behind an empty continent. Its Western Empire ended, its authority fragmented. Its cities changed, its economy became more local in many places. Its old confidence in a single imperial order slowly faded, but people continued. They continued in the quiet spaces between famous events, in kitchens and workshops, in vineyards and grain fields, in fishing boats and mountain villages, in churches built into old Roman buildings, in towns where ancient walls enclosed fewer homes than before, but still enclosed homes. They did not know they were living in the early Middle Ages. They did not know that later generations would call their world a dark age, a transition, a collapse, or a rebirth. They only knew that the old world had changed, and that morning still came. There were animals to feed, bread to bake, children to teach, dead to bury, promises to keep, roads to travel, stories to tell. An empire ended, but people continued. If you enjoyed this quiet journey through the lost century after Rome fell, please like the video, comment and subscribe. And let me know where in the world you are listening from tonight. The best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify through the link in the description.